They were never the ones to chase the spotlight, and yet their presence on screen in sound and silent photographs left marks that time couldn't erase. Today we invite you to slow down for a moment, to listen not to breaking news, but to broken silences, to remember the quiet giants whose names might have slipped out of headlines, but never out of meaning. From the aging heartbeat of jazz to the echo of a once iconic British voice. From the corridors of television sets to the unseen shadows of exile. These are 5 lives that deserve not just an ending, but an elegy. Who were they really? What burden did they carry when the applause faded and the crowds dispersed? And in those final days, what truths were left unsaid? Let's begin this journey through fading lights, unfinished notes, and whispered legacies. He wasn't smooth. He was fire, controlled chaos, a thunderclap behind the keys. And yet beneath the bravado was a deeply spiritual man, committed to heritage, to justice, to truth. He saw music as more than entertainment. It was resistance history, survival. Even in his later years, long after the charts moved on, Palmieri kept playing. Because for him, music wasn't a career. It was a conversation with the divine. But what happens when the song starts to slow, and the silence begins to stretch between notes? In the later chapters of his life, Eddie Palmieri didn't slow down. He simply shifted key. While his touring schedule thinned and the stage lights dimmed, his mind remained sharp, his hands still eager to summon thunder from the piano. But the world around him had changed. The clubs were smaller, the crowds grayer. The spotlight shared with younger artists now flickered in bursts, not beams. Yet, Palmieri never played for the lights. Into his 80s, he continued to perform, often sitting just a little longer, at the keys letting the silence speak before the music resumed. His solos grew more introspective, less fireworks, more storytelling. Notes carried not just rhythm, but memory. A whisper of Harlem, a flash of San Juan, a lifetime wrapped into one descending chord. Behind the scenes, his body began to resist the pace he once commanded. Arthritis tightened his fingers. Hearing loss dulled the sharpness of his improvisation. But none of it stopped him. He adjusted, rearranged, simplified, and in doing so, revealed even deeper truths in the music. Those close to him noticed a shift not in talent, but in tone. Palmieri grew more reflective. In interviews, he spoke less about performance and more about legacy. Music outlives the man, he once said, but only if the man leaves truth behind. He spent increasing time mentoring younger musicians, especially Latino youth, pushing them not to imitate him, but to find their own chaos, their own rhythm. He would laugh, lean in, and tell them, "Don't play it safe, play it honest." There were no farewell tours, no dramatic retirements, just an old man at the piano, still searching, still questioning, still insisting that every note had meaning, even the ones left unplayed. But even a sun, no matter how brilliant, must one day dip beneath the horizon. And the question lingered, would the world keep listening once the music stopped? Eddie Palmieri passed away in the early spring of 2025 at the age of 88. He died in his sleep at home in the Bronx, the very borough where his journey began. The official statement released by his family was brief and poetic. The rhythm slowed, but never stopped. Eddie played his last note with grace. In the final weeks of his life, he remained surrounded by music. Former students visited regularly, sometimes playing for him instead of the other way around. He would sit back in his armchair, eyes closed, smiling faintly, as if hearing rhythms only he could truly understand. His last public appearance came just months before his death, at a small benefit concert in East Harlem. He didn't perform. He just walked on stage, took a seat by the piano, placed his hands over the keys, and then simply looked at the crowd. No music, no speech, just presence. And somehow, that silence said everything. When the news of his death broke, Latin radio stations across the country played his records for 24 hours straight. Fans lit candles in Puerto Rican neighborhoods from New York to Miami. An entire culture paused to remember the man who had given it a sound. But does music really end when the musician is gone? Or does it simply change form and echo on? Eddie Palmieri didn't just play Latin jazz, he remixed its very DNA. With every tumbao and dissonant chord, he pushed boundaries that many were too afraid to question. He wasn't interested in making the genre more palatable. He made it truthful, raw, alive. Over the course of his career, Palmieri won multiple Grammys. But those golden statues barely scratched the surface of his influence. His real awards came in the form of generations musicians who studied his every phrasing, dancers who moved because he made rhythm unavoidable, and listeners who didn't even realize they were being taught something sacred. He was a bridge between past and future, a keeper of ancestral drums and a prophet of sonic rebellion. Even now, his compositions are taught in conservatories alongside Bach and Coltrane, proof that street-born brilliance belongs in ivory towers too. When he passed, tributes flowed in from salsa legends, jazz titans, and punk poets alike. Few artists could unite such a spectrum, but Palmieri always believed music was the great equalizer, the great liberator. He said once, "You don't need to understand me, you just need to feel what I'm saying." And we did. We still do, because rhythm doesn't die. It just waits for the next heartbeat. Born in Brooklyn in 1929, Jerry Adler seemed destined for the stage before he ever stepped onto it. The son of a Jewish immigrant and nephew of famed theater director Jacob Ben-Ami, Adler grew up breathing the dust of Broadway backstages and the scent of old scripts. Yet, he didn't rush into the limelight. Instead, he built a career on scaffolding, mastering the art of direction before ever taking center stage. By the time he was recognized by the public, Adler was already a veteran behind the scenes, having directed countless Broadway productions, and earned the respect of an entire generation of performers. But it wasn't until later in life that his true face emerged on screen as the gruff yet warm-hearted Hesh Rabkin in The Sopranos, or as Howard Lyman in The Good Wife. Always the supporting player, always unforgettable. His brilliance lay not in grand gestures, but in restraint, in knowing when to speak and when to simply exist in a scene. Jerry Adler wasn't interested in being a star. He was there to serve the story. And perhaps that's why we're here today to tell his. As the years crept in, Jerry Adler remained remarkably present in the world he helped shape, but from a quieter distance. Unlike many of his peers who either faded into obscurity or clung desperately to fame, Adler embraced age with a rare kind of grace. He didn't chase roles. Roles came to him. Even in his 80s and 90s, Adler continued to appear on screen, not out of necessity, but out of love. In Living with Yourself, 2019, he played Paul, the father of Paul Rudd's character, with a poignancy that felt almost autobiographical. Behind the scenes, though, time was catching up. He moved a little slower. His voice, though steady, bore the slight wear of a life fully lived. There were no scandals, no tabloid headlines. Instead, there was solitude chosen, or otherwise. Adler gave fewer interviews. He declined event invitations. Friends from the Broadway days noticed how he rarely returned calls, but always sent handwritten holiday cards. One of the rare moments he opened up came in a podcast interview in his early 90s. When asked what kept him going, Adler replied, "A story well told. That's all that matters. Doesn't matter who tells it or if they remember your name." There was a kind of wisdom in his withdrawal, not bitterness, but clarity. He had seen the industry evolve from the golden age of stage to the age of streaming, from black and white morals to morally gray anti-heroes. He played his part, then stepped back without fanfare. And still there was a lingering question. Was it contentment or quiet loneliness that filled his final years? We may never fully know, but what remains is the haunting beauty of a man who chose to exit the spotlight long before the curtain fell. Jerry Adler passed away quietly in his Manhattan apartment on a chilly morning in early 2024. There was no press release prepared in advance, no grand announcement. Just a few lines sent to family and a handful of close friends. Jerry left us peacefully in his sleep. He was 94, The news reached the public not through a viral headline, but a simple obituary in the New York Times. Industry peers like Edie Falco and Alan Alda shared brief, heartfelt tributes. "He made silence speak," one wrote. "He knew how to leave space for others to shine," said another. No one was at his side when he died, at least not physically. His wife had passed decades earlier, and he had no children. But his shelves were lined with letters yellowing playbills and photos from decades of performances, a lifetime of echoes. A neighbor recalled that the night before she heard music drifting from his window, an old Sondheim number played on loop. No one knew if he pressed play or if it was set to repeat long before. Either way, it played on. But is that really all there is to his ending? Or did Jerry Adler leave behind something that refuses to fade? Jerry Adler never headlined blockbuster films. He didn't win an Oscar or make tabloid covers. But his legacy lives in moments, those subtle blink-and-you-miss-it performances that linger longer than any spotlight. To Broadway veterans, he was the master of structure, the man who shaped performances behind the curtain with a steady, invisible hand. To television audiences, he was that familiar face who never overplayed, never forced emotion, but somehow made every line feel lived in. Whether as a sarcastic advisor to mobsters or a grieving father in quiet drama, Adler gave dignity to characters others would have dismissed as minor. His performances are still taught in theater programs, not as flamboyant examples of star power, but as case studies in restraint, timing, and grace. And for those who knew him even briefly, he left something deeper: kindness without showmanship, wisdom without ego. In a business that often rewards noise, Jerry Adler was the silence that gave it shape. Years from now, his name may fade from memory, but his fingerprints remain on stages, on screens, and on the hearts of those who believe that a quiet performance can speak the loudest. Long before the age of viral fame and curated personas, there was Loni Anderson, blonde, poised and impossible to ignore. For millions of Americans in the late 1970s, she wasn't just a TV actress. She was the television goddess. Born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1945, Anderson's path to stardom wasn't handed to her. She studied art, taught school, raised a child, and then almost by accident became the face of a generation. As Jennifer Marlowe in WKRP in Cincinnati, she redefined the role of the sexy receptionist with wit sharper than her wardrobe and a presence that turned every sitcom beat into a lesson in elegance and control. But behind the glamour was a woman navigating the brutal contradictions of fame, praised for her beauty, underestimated for her brains, admired on screen, scrutinized off it. Through turbulent marriages, public tabloid storms, and the quiet struggles of motherhood, Anderson never stopped holding her head high, even when the camera was no longer rolling. She wasn't just a fantasy, she was a fighter dressed in satin. And now, as her name fades from headlines, a question remains. Did the world ever truly see the woman behind the image? As the lights of Hollywood dimmed around her, Loni Anderson chose not to fight the fade, but to soften with it. She didn't vanish, nor did she cling to youth through spectacle. Instead, she rewrote her own script, gently stepping away from sitcom fame and towards something quieter, more personal. The 1990s and early 2000s brought sporadic appearances in TV, movies, and guest roles, but nothing came close to the frenzy of her WKRP years. And that was intentional. Anderson turned her focus to advocacy, particularly for COPD awareness, a disease her parents had battled silently for years. She became a voice not for ratings, but for remembrance. Her third marriage to folk musician Bob Flick was markedly different from the public implosions that preceded it. No headlines, no courtroom drama, just two people aging in parallel, finding solace in shared silences. Friends noted how happy she seemed, at last calmer, slower, content to be invisible to the industry that once devoured her. But time, as always, had its own agenda. By her late 70s, Anderson's public appearances grew fewer. A slight tremor in her hands made signing autographs difficult. She quietly declined interviews. Even fan conventions, once a staple, became too exhausting. What few knew was that she had begun journaling obsessively dozens of leather-bound books filled with thoughts she never shared, reflections on womanhood, on fame, on being beautiful, and being dismissed. One close friend revealed she always said her best performance was the one no one ever saw, the one she gave in private. There were no breakdowns, no final roles, just a woman slowly retreating from the world's gaze, reclaiming parts of herself piece by piece. And yet, even as she faded from the public eye, Loni Anderson remained etched in memory, an icon turned enigma. But did she find peace in the quiet, or did the silence echo louder than applause ever could? Loni Anderson passed away quietly in the summer of 2025 at the age of 80 in her home in Sherman Oaks, California. The official cause was complications related to a series of mini-strokes, nothing sudden, just the body yielding after a long and graceful life. Her family kept the announcement brief. She lived with beauty, fought with grace, and left us in peace. There was no media circus, no crowds outside her home. Just a few bouquets lay gently at her doorstep, and tributes from fans who had grown up watching her, but never stopped remembering her. In her final days, Loni was surrounded by her husband, Bob, her children, and a handful of close friends. They played old jazz records read from her favorite journals and let the room be filled with stillness, something she had learned to cherish after a lifetime of noise. She didn't want a public funeral. Instead, her ashes were scattered near a lake in Minnesota, where she spent her childhood summers. It was, as one friend described, the first time she truly felt unseen and truly free. But is that where her story ends? Or is she still there in a flash of blonde, a knowing smile, a rerun at 2 a.m.? Loni Anderson may have been typecast as the glamorous blonde, but her true legacy lies in how she shattered that image from within. On WKRP in Cincinnati, she took a role that could have been one note and turned it into a quiet revolution. Jennifer Marlowe wasn't just pretty, she was poised, smart, unfazed. In a time when female characters were too often written as ornaments, Loni played one like a mirror. She never won an Emmy, she didn't need to. Her impact was cultural, not statistical. Women across America saw her and thought, I can be both beautiful and in control. She gave permission without ever asking for it. Her later years only deepened that legacy. Through health advocacy, public honesty about aging, and her resistance to the performative demands of fame, Loni became something few Hollywood figures ever achieve: human. Not a brand, not a relic. A woman who aged without apology. When she died, tributes didn't come just from celebrities, but from nurses, teachers, retirees, people who felt seen, understood, or simply entertained by her presence. She was my first role model, one woman wrote online. Not because she was perfect, because she wasn't. And that's how she'll be remembered, not as a symbol, but as a story worth telling. There was a time when Terence Stamp wasn't just a name, he was a presence. With cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a gaze that could silence a room, Stamp became one of the most enigmatic faces of British cinema in the 1960s. Born in London in 1938, he rose to prominence almost overnight, with his breakthrough performance in Billy Budd, earning an Academy Award nomination at just 24. But fame never sat comfortably on his shoulders. While contemporaries chased Hollywood lights, Stamp drifted through Rome, India, the counterculture. He turned down blockbusters, vanished for years, reappeared in unexpected places. He played popes and villains, lovers and loners, never letting himself be boxed in. Even when he took on the role of General Zod in Superman 2, it was less about commercial appeal and more about control. He made the villain regal, haunting. Stamp's mystique wasn't an accident. He was an actor who walked away from the noise, who chose poetry over press tours, solitude over stardom, and yet his influence lingered in fashion and film, in the idea of what it meant to be a leading man. He didn't just act, he haunted the frame. But what happens to the myth when the man begins to fade? In the twilight of his life, Terence Stamp seemed to embrace the very thing he had spent decades mastering: distance. While other actors leaned into reinvention, Stamp leaned back, observing, reflecting, letting the world speak first. He relocated to the English countryside, away from red carpets and film sets, trading celebrity for stillness. Interviews became rare, and when they did occur, he spoke in riddles of karma, of silence, of how he had stopped watching his own performances. "I don't act anymore," he once said softly. "I remember. The industry never forgot him." Younger filmmakers sought him out, hoping to capture a sliver of that old magic. And when he appeared, whether in a quiet art house film or a brief supporting role, he brought with him the weight of history, like an echo wrapped in flesh. But age inevitably crept in, a slow, progressive deterioration of hearing, trouble with his balance. He took fewer roles, spent more time walking alone through fields behind his cottage. Locals recall spotting him in bookstores, browsing poetry or Eastern philosophy, always polite, always slightly elsewhere. Friends noted a shift in his letters, longer pauses between replies, more references to dreams and past lives. One wrote, "Terence didn't seem afraid of death. He seemed to have already visited it, sat with it, and come back for tea." By the early 2020s, Stamp had quietly declined multiple film offers. He no longer sought to perform, but to observe. In one of his last public appearances at a film festival, retrospective, he looked out at the crowd and said, "I used to think the camera captured me. Now I think it just borrowed me for a little while." He smiled, then stepped off the stage. And from that moment on, he drifted further from roles, further from headlines. But did he find peace in that vanishing? Or was it in some way another performance? Terence Stamp passed away in the early hours of a foggy February morning in 2024. He was 85. There were no flashing alerts, no trending hashtags. Just a single statement released by his longtime literary agent. He died in his sleep in the place he loved most, surrounded by books, not cameras. He had been living in a modest stone cottage in Wiltshire, England, far removed from the flashbulbs of Hollywood or the studios of Pinewood. His health had been quietly declining for months. Nothing dramatic, just the slow unwinding of a long and singular life. When news broke the film, world responded not with shock, but with reverence. Directors like Steven Soderbergh and Terrence Malick offered quiet tributes. Fellow actors called him a riddle wrapped in elegance. A former co-star wrote simply, "He never shouted. He never had to." There were no final interviews, no deathbed memoirs, just a whisper of a man slipping out of frame. And in that absence, like the negative space in a photograph, his presence somehow became even louder. But was it the final scene, or merely the last time he chose to be seen? Terence Stamp was never the loudest man in the room, but somehow he was always the one you remembered. From the collector to the limey, from regal villains to wounded romantics, his performances weren't just watched, they were felt, absorbed, carried. He brought gravitas to pulp poetry to silence. Directors often said they cast him, not just for what he could say, but for what he could hold back. He mastered the art of suggestion, of standing still, while the world spun around him. Even his pauses were unforgettable. His influence extended far beyond the screen. Fashion designers cited him as a muse. Young actors mimicked his cadence. He became a symbol not just of masculine cool, but of artistic restraint, of the allure of withholding. When he died, tributes were less about his roles and more about his presence. He changed how I thought about being on camera, one actor shared. He reminded me that stillness can scream. Stamp never begged to be seen. He simply was. And in a culture obsessed with visibility, that alone became revolutionary. Now that he's gone, the silence he leaves behind feels almost deliberate, as if he knew the loudest echoes come after the quietest exits. Tristan Rogers was never meant to be a household name in America, at least not at first. Born in Melbourne, Australia in 1946, he started out chasing bit parts and voice work in his native country. But everything changed in 1980 when he stepped into the role of Robert Scorpio on General Hospital. Suave, mysterious, and unmistakably charming Rogers captivated daytime television in a way few foreign actors ever had. He wasn't just an actor, he was a phenomenon. With his crisp accent and piercing intensity, he turned what could have been a soap opera stereotype into something magnetic. Fans didn't just watch Robert Scorpio, they believed in him. Across decades, multiple departures and returns, Rogers remained one of the most enduring faces of the genre. Yet beyond the camera, Tristan Rogers carried a complexity all his own. He spoke candidly about the burdens of fame, the grind of daytime television, and his longing for artistic freedom. Though he dabbled in other roles, it was clear Scorpio was both his blessing and his prison. Now, as the credits inch toward the final scene of his story, one wonders, did the world ever really see the man behind the spy? As Tristan Rogers aged, so did Robert Scorpio, but the line between the two grew increasingly blurred. For decades, fans watched the character evolve, yet behind the scenes, Rogers was wrestling with a slow-burning fatigue of being typecast, of being frozen in time. In interviews from the late 2010s, his candor surprised many. "People think I'm Robert," he once said. But Robert's only a fraction of me. He spoke of creative frustration, of longing to take risks that the soap opera machine never allowed. While he continued appearing in General Hospital well into his 70s, the spark behind his eyes occasionally dimmed, not from lack of love for the craft, but from repetition that dulled the edges of ambition. His personal life remained largely private. He settled into a quiet home life in California, with his wife growing more selective about public appearances. Off camera, he spent time advocating for mental health awareness in the entertainment industry, often pointing out how little support aging actors received once they were no longer seen as marketable. Friends noted a shift in recent years. Rogers grew more contemplative, sometimes melancholic. He reportedly declined major interviews, opting instead for long drives alone up the Pacific coast. A former co-star recalled, "He was sharp as ever, but there was this distant look sometimes, like he was already halfway out the door." In 2023, a minor stroke sidelined him for several weeks. Though he recovered, it left a lingering vulnerability in his voice, a softness that fans picked up on in his final episodes. "It felt like goodbye," one longtime viewer tweeted. Still, Rogers never publicly announced a farewell. He simply stepped away as if closing a door gently without locking it. But in that silence, in that final retreat, what truths were left unspoken? Tristan Rogers passed away in early 2025 at the age of 78 in the quiet of his coastal California home. There was no media frenzy, no flashing headlines, just a single post from his family. Tristan left us peacefully surrounded by love and the sea he always adored. It was fitting. The man who had played a spy for decades had chosen a quiet exit, like a final scene written in soft pencil. He was survived by his wife Teresa and a few close friends from his decades in television. At the time of his passing, tributes poured in not from Hollywood elites, but from everyday fans. Nurses who'd grown up watching General Hospital. Veterans who identified with Scorpio's calm under pressure. People who had never met him, but somehow felt they had. His final appearance on the show aired just weeks before his death. In it, Scorpio delivers a cryptic goodbye, his voice trembling slightly, his eyes distant. No one knew it would be his last scene, but somehow it felt like he did. Still, one wonders, was the curtain closing, or was it simply Tristan stepping away from the stage one final time? For many, Tristan Rogers will forever be Robert Scorpio, sharp-eyed, steady-handed, the eternal anchor in a world of soap opera chaos. But his legacy extends far beyond a single role. Rogers helped redefine what a soap character could be. At a time when daytime television often leaned into melodrama, he brought subtlety, depth, and emotional restraint. He proved that viewers didn't need explosions or shouting matches to feel something, they just needed truth. And Rogers delivered that episode after episode for over 4 decades. His portrayal inspired a generation of actors and writers to aim higher, to treat the genre with the dignity it deserved. Even in reruns, his presence remains magnetic, a masterclass in character-building quiet power and professional longevity. Outside the screen, his advocacy for mental health among performers struck a chord in an industry that too often forgets its aging stars. His voice, once strong and defiant, became softer in later years, but no less impactful. When the news of his passing spread, social media lit up, not with celebrity tributes, but with gratitude. "He was part of my afternoons for 30 years, one fan wrote. "I didn't know him, but I loved him." And in the end, perhaps that's the greatest legacy of all, to be remembered by those who never met you, but felt seen because of you. They were never meant to be footnotes. They were fire, melody, mystery, and grace. And though their voices have quieted, the echoes remain in piano keys and screen flickers in the spaces they once filled with light. Dignity doesn't make headlines, but it leaves marks. And these 5 lives remind us fame may fade, but meaning endures. So now we ask you, which moment stays with you? Was it a look, a line, a note, a silence? Let us know in the comments. Share what they meant to you, because memory is a chorus and every voice matters. And if their stories moved, you stay with us. Like, comment, and subscribe for more voices that still deserve to be heard. Because though they've gone, the light they left behind still shines.